So good afternoon again. Thank you again for being here. So here's our second panel on the temporalities of the 68 years. We have three presentations today. I'm going to introduce extremely briefly the three presenters at once. We start with Julian Burke, who is a associate professor of history at Boston College, also the associate dean for the core, and who has written a very important and influential book on the many intellectual aftermaths of the 68 in France, called From Revolution to Ethics, May 1968 and Contemporary French Thought, which was published in 2007. And he's also translated a book by Claude Lefort, Complications, Communism and the Dilemmas of Democracy in 2007. And he has edited another book called After the Deluge, New Perspective of the Intellectual and Cultural History of Post-War France in 2004. Then we will have a presentation by Frédéric Gros, who is a professor of political humanities at Sciences Po in Paris. He is a philosopher and a novelist. He has worked on the question of war with a book called État de violence in 2006 and Security, Le Principe Sécurité, published in 2012, and more recently on Disobedience, Désobéir, published in 2017. And it's a book that is going to present at Albertine, right, on Monday. So you welcome. What is it? 7? 6? 7. In the Albertine, the French bookstore, Fifth Avenue. And as you, many of you know, he's also a scholar of Foucault. So he has analyzed in several books, and he has also edited the 4 last years of lectures at the Collège de France, which was on classical philosophy, from the subjectivité et vérité to le courage de la vérité. And he has also, he's also the editor of of the last volume of the history of sexuality called Les Aveux de la Chair, the confession of the flesh, was just published a few months ago in France. And last but not least on our panel today, Professor Christine Ross, who's professor of comparative literature at NYU, the author of what I think is the most important political book in English about May 68 and its afterlife, published in 2002. And more recently, Communal Luxury, the Political Imaginary of the Paris Commune, was published by Verso 2015, and in French by La Fabrique, also in 2015. And even more recently, a translation and with a critical introduction of the ZAP collective, the Mauvaise Troupe book, which she translated under the title The ZAP, we don't have territorial struggles and the making of a new political intelligence in 2000, published by Verso also in 2018. So thank you very much to the three of you for being here. And we start with Julian Burke.
Thank you so much to Emmanuel and the other organizers. So we are here to commemorate, to remember together. And so memory is obviously a first temporality. I'm imagining that there's 3 types of people in the room, I would guess. There's those who have memories of the era of 1968. There's those such as myself who grew up very much under the shadow of the 1960s my entire life. And I also think there's younger people here who are wondering, what is all the buzz? What is all the discussion? Why are we talking about 1968 today? So I'm going to talk about 3 times and spaces of 1968. First, what's already been broached, I want to deal with it more systematically, the general context of May 1968 around the world, and then turn to a local iconic case, the French events, and really return to the specificity of that, given that we have taken the global turn. And then, if there's time, I'd like to make a few sort of comments of theses about the relationship between 1968 and us today. What's exciting for me about talking about 1968 is that we're never done with it. I'm going to be mentioning a few times in spaces. You all will think of others, and I think that will lead to a productive conversation. So I want to begin by stating the obvious. And that when we think about May and June 1968 in France, we have to move to 1968 as an eventful year, and also how 1968 itself represents a larger moment, the global 60s, or as we've already mentioned before, les années 68. Now, an important caveat is that the term 1968 in many parts of the world has no discernible meaning. 1968 does not resonate in all times and places. And in some sense, there are non-spaces that are out of time with our concern here. But anyway you cut it, 1968 was an eventful year. On one hand, that's superficial because all years are eventful, but it is nonetheless true that there was a convergence of events and forces and movements all over the world that year. Well-known iconic hotspots, but also less famous people, places, and events. I agree with Françoise Bloom, who says that we are now in the midst of historiographically turning and trying to understand the global 60s, and I think that process has been underway really for the past 10 years, since the 40th anniversary, and there's much work to do. Our two papers today, the work of Burley Hendrickson, who's in the room, has contributed to that as well. Scholars continue to excavate the non-iconic, the non-May 68s, and what's apparent to me in 2018 is not so much north-south relationships, but looking at what we would call south-south 68s that do not refer to the metropoles or the global north, and that is a cutting edge. We've made great advances, I think, of moving away from what one person has called, Daniel Gordon, the memory barons. So there were 30 years, discussions in 68 were really controlled as a discourse by those who had experienced the events, and I think those of us of different generations for the past decade or more have been trying to excavate in theory and in history the complexities of 1968. So to state the obvious here, 1968 stands for the 60s as a whole, not just an eventful year. Extensive worldwide ferment, unrest, disorder, but also, as we've heard, emancipatory movements against hierarchy and equality. And in some sense, 1968 represents an era. It's a synecdoche. It is a part of a whole that represents the whole. The 60s. Scholars refer to the 68 years, the long 60s, even now to the long 70s, as the time and place of 1968. Merci Françoise Bloom for mentioning the Bandung Conference of 1955 in the Global South. This is one way to periodize the long 60s. From the Bandung Conference in 1955 to the new International Economic Order of 1974, the last serious attempt in geopolitics to deal with the divergence of economic disparity between North and Southern hemispheres. In the United States and Western Europe, we could also think about the long 60s going from rebels with a cause and rebels without causes, from James Dean and the Montgomery boycott, all the way to the German autumn of 1977, which is a crescendo of far-left violence, which really declined precipitously after the fall of 1977. The Cold War was mentioned before, and it is worth remarking that the year 1968 appears chronologically exactly halfway between 1945 and 1989, between the end of World War II and the end of the Cold War. It marks a turning point in many ways. Typically, when we talk about eras as historians, we look back on them as finished. They can be sliced variously, and so I'm going to interrogate that question and possibility as we move forward. So just for this very quick and dirty look at 1968 as an eventful year representing the global 60s, there are a number of temporalities that stand out. First of all, simultaneity. The way that surprising, eruptive upheaval was happening all over the world at the same time. I'll give you two concrete examples. In February of 1968, the Tet Offensive puts the United States military in Vietnam on the defensive, and there is a great surprise around the world, including the American security establishment, about what's happening there. That same month in Berlin, Western European anti-war activists gather for a conference. And this, I really am taking this from a recent dissertation from Pennsylvania by Salar Mohandisi, that the activists at this conference saw what was happening with the Viet Cong against the Americans, and they said, if they can stand up to the Americans, we should be doing more. We should intensify our efforts, and as the Weather Underground would say, bring the war home to the West. So this convergence, a chance convergence between this conference and the Tet Offensive. Another example, this is actually the same month of February, and this is a question of forgetting. This is not often the narratives of the American 68, that 3 African-American students were killed in Orangeburg, South Carolina. It doesn't figure in the Columbia to Chicago narrative of the American 60s. The second example I want to give is on April 11th, Lyndon Johnson signs the Fair Housing Act, and that same day, Rudi Dutschke, who had been one of the leaders at the Berlin Conference, German student leader, survives an assassination attempt on that same day. My understanding is that that same day, Columbia students who were in the midst of happenings here marched down to the German publisher Springer's main office to protest. So again, we have this triangulation of events in the United States to Europe, back to the United States. So the cumulative effect of this that I want to emphasize of the notion of simultaneity is the accumulating density and magnitude, the intensification. And I got a sense of that from Ludwig's a paper earlier today, the density of the happenings all over France at the same time in multiple locales. But there's also a sense here that to talk about simultaneity is to spatialize time, to flatten time out. What happens over there affects me here. There's a sense in 1968 that we cannot escape from a world space that may be unmappable as a totality, and it's always existed, but there is in 1968 a new consciousness of inhabiting a small blue globe. And this is also an important image from 1968's Moonrise, the first picture of the Earth from this perspective, December 24th, 1968. Alongside simultaneity, obviously I want to emphasize multiplicity. And here we have, in some sense, the temporalization of space. How all the multiple happenings simultaneously in the 60s, in 1968 and the 60s, they're contingent, they're unstable. Every time, even today, we try to grasp 1968, it slips away. It's elsewhere. Ludwig mentioned the constantly moving dancers, the way that the dancers are constantly moving all the time. So multiplicity appears here in a double sense. Both there in the fact that there are many dimensions to 1968, as well as multiplicity is a value that 68ers take up against hierarchy. So what I'm playing with here of simultaneity and multiplicity really evokes David Harvey's older idea that in the post-war world, there is, under a new regime of capitalism, a time-space compression that is happening around the world. Increased speed, collapsing distances. Borders are being crossed in real ways, as American anti-war activists go to Berlin, as French Maoists visit China, but also imaginative border crossings. Again, condensing the world in a type of simultaneity, which sometimes leads to a real proximity, but also the fantasy of proximity. Maoism in France in 1968 is a very, very different creature than Maoism in China that year. And the last point I want to make initially in this first part of the talk is the notion of an era. As I said, historians tend to treat eras in a post facto way as being finished. Well, the question and interrogation that we're asking in our mere presence here today is that, are we finished with 1968? Are we finished with the 60s? We're still talking about it today, and the way I'll refer to this in the end, if I have time, is the notion of the living traditions that are born in 1968 and continue today, and we've heard part of them echo through the open window this afternoon. The good news, I think, is that we're never done interpreting 1968. It remains an infinite task. So from this global perspective of May 1968 in the context of larger happenings, not only that year, but in a more general era, I want to return to the events of May, June 1968 in France. I want to emphasize a particular point. We are grateful and indebted to those who are working on globalizing the 1960s, dethroning the focus on the United States and Europe. And I think we can return to May 68 in France with greater humility as a dramatic and influential moment that's not more important than what happened in Dakar or Tokyo. It's one space, one moment among many occurring at the same time. And the way that I want to think about this reapproach to 1968 is to return to some of the language of the moment. And that is to think about writing the event. And here I want to begin with a citation from Roland Barthes' December 1968 essay of that name, in which he says the following: to describe the event implies that the event has been written. Now, from my perspective, Barth's article is actually quite a conservative article, because he says in there that all sides in France in 1968 were participating in the same symbolic discourse. Both protesters and police, both radicals and the state, all acknowledged the certain salience, the symbolic salience of particular acts, performances, the way that Barth said that the wild speech of the student quarter was ineffectual, that eventually pretty standard calls for reform came out from the dominant unions and the political parties. So Barth is really skeptical by December that something important has happened, and the notion of writing, of being fixed and frozen, that the ink has dried for Barth by 1968. And obviously I'm going to come to disturb that notion. And I'm going to do that in three ways. I'm going to make three moves here. One, I'm going to talk about marking space in May 1968. I'm going to talk about the space of writing and the notion of the events themselves. Because one of the great fruits of this moment is reflection that French thinkers brought to what is an event. We are experiencing events. What is an event? How do we recognize it? Are there true events and false events? Can we cause events? How do we respond to events? Can the energy of events be sustained over time, particularly when they are anti-structural by definition? So the first move is marking space, and I want to use a term from literary theory of palimpsest. Just for those who are not familiar with this term, it refers to the idea of back in the time when paper was very expensive, people would write things down, and when they were done with it, they would erase it and write new things down. But scholars now go back to texts from the 16th and 17th and 18th century, and we can see the underwriting that is still there, the traces of the writing that were erased but still exist, in a way that painters would recycle canvases, and we can discern, with technology today, the painting underneath the painting. So this is the sense of the multi-layeredness of space that I want to play with. Now, among the energies of the Latin Quarter in May and June 1968, a crucial symbolic site was the barricade, and indeed there's a famous book called 1968, The Year of the Barricades. I think it is a very important point to reference the point before that Foucault, when he came back in the fall of 1968, said that there was no real risk happening here compared to Tunisia. So we need to keep in mind what is happening here, although dramatic and influential, they're not the same stakes, obviously, that are happening when people are being imprisoned and tortured in places like Tunisia. The barricade serves a dual function. It demarcates liberated space, defining an inside and an outside, and remarkably, the police could have entered really much at any time, and they refused to do so. They, in some sense, in lack of intervening, the student-occupied space, which included the Odeon Theater in Paris, was left to the students' devices for multiple weeks. In addition to demarcating and liberated space, and here comes the notion of palimpsest, it's also a way to connect to France's revolutionary past. A citation of other revolutionary moments of 1830, of 1848. And here I want to say that on June 24th, 1968, Hannah Arendt wrote to her friend Karl Jaspers and said, "The children of the next century will study 1968 in the same way that our generation studied 1848. And so that, in some sense, is what we're doing here with students who are currently at Columbia. It also involves the citation of the Commune of Paris, and here we are really all indebted to Kristen Ross's work, the Commune, drawing connections between then and now. And there's a very powerful way that the Paris Commune served as a horizon of imagination for the European left between 1871 and 1917. There's lots of reference to the Commune until the Russian Revolution of 1917. By analogy, we can think about how 1968 has served, continues to serve today as a horizon of imagination for social movements to our own day. Barricades including the liberation of Paris in 1944. Now, the notion of palimpsest, obviously, is not just these images, but in the actual spaces of Paris. The barricades of 1830 and 1848 are located at the same street corners. It's an important shift from the right bank to the left bank in 1968. And here we also have the centers of power, in some ways, or symbolic power, shifting from central administration and the bourse in the right bank to the student quarter in this new age of information and service economy that is emerging. Palimpsest, precursors, antecedents, the longue durée. There are deep temporalities at work, literally below the surface of the barricades in France. The pavés pulled up not only to find sand, but also to find different types of history. The second type of space of writing that I'd like to reference, and it needs to be done today, so I'll have the responsibility to do it, that we do need to note the transient, ephemeral, imaginative, playful writing that happened on the walls in May 1968. Of the graffiti, spontaneous, without authorship, anonymous, but also the celebrated Atelier Populaire posters, in which writing here is doubled over, participation as well as profit. Senses of temporality, even in the midst of 1968, that something has opened that risks being closed. An awareness in that immediacy of possibilities opened either to be shut down or also the beginning of a longer temporality, a longer durée. I do want to note here that the soundbite lucidity of these ephemeral traces were immediately transmitted within France and around the world. They served a type of critical iconicity, because this is a moment in the history of the media sphere where there is great amount of circulation without the type of saturation that we experience today. So that these images are replicated among students and young people and movements around the world. So in emphasizing the space of writing in the graffiti and the posters, the last type of writing I want to emphasize is the space of theoretical writing and discourse. All of us who are educated in humanities since the 1980s are aware of the great import and power of French theory that we made our own after we decontextualized it from France in the Anglophone world. Questions of language and subjectivity and power and desire and multiplicity are part of our critical vernacular in the United States due to our uses and abuses of French thinkers such as Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze, and others. There's one great crystallization of theory in 1968 itself, and that has to do with the notion of events, of the eventfulness of French events. Thinking about the concept of the event itself happened immediately. We've already seen Roland Barthes' version. There were other what I would call contra-Barthes, from Claude Lefort immediately to Michel Foucault the following year in the postface to the Archaeology of Knowledge is theorizing the event. The two people that I would like to call our attention to and give citations from are Henri Lefebvre. Events disprove forecasts. To the extent that events are historic, they upset calculations. Events upset structures which made them possible. In terms of intellectual history, this is a shift towards what the French would call late structuralism, or what we would call post-structuralism. And I think even more powerfully, Michel de Certeau, who brought together the theme of event and space here, wrote in that fall, the event cannot be dissociated from the options to which it gave place. It is that space, constituted by often surprising choices. He goes on to say, and this is a longer quote, an event is not what can be seen and known about its happening, but what it becomes. And above all for us, this option is grasped only in risk, not by observation. Interpretation could still be the sign of events. The event engages the structure. The whole order is at stake, and first of all, it seems to me, a system of representation what grounds both knowledge and politics. So, from de Certeau's perspective, what mattered were the future representations. Where does the energy unleashed by these events go? What becomes of the event? Will new structures be adequate to the event, or does the idea of a structure or an institution itself undermine the energy and the opening of possibilities of the event? Will new structures prove adequate or equal to the possibilities of the events? And I have to say that I think we've been caught in this dilemma for 50 years now. That the possibilities and promise of 1968, which is commemorated this year, and the disconnect between the way that institutions and states and macro organizations have gone over the 50 years, this disconnect between dream and reality or event and structure continues to haunt us. There are many temporalities of the event. In some sense, many structures of the event. Events are unforeseen, they're unpredictable, they're uncontrollable. Events disrupt seemingly frozen structures, and they inaugurate a new relationship to time. Lafore referred to the indeterminate possibility of May 1968, or what someone said earlier today, the concrete specter of other futures, an opening of possibility related to spontaneity, immediacy, openness, and again that term, multiplicity. Many protagonists in 1968 and France's elsewhere describe the convergence of an inner sense of freedom with a sense of solidarity and complicity with others who share that sense of freedom, a sense of equality that built community in an immediate opening of the possible. The great dilemma of the moment is that issue of structure, how to sustain the energies of the 1968 movements. The poster for our conference, the beginning of a long struggle, or the struggle continues. In Germany, they spoke of the long march through the institutions. In the United States, 1968 has a darker image. As one book says, it's the year the dream died between the assassinations of King and Kennedy and the Chicago Convention. So what I've tried to illustrate is that there are many times in spaces of 1968, I've referenced a few of them, the global 1968, simultaneous effervescence of multiple events in an era that may be past in many ways, but in other ways remains open and continues today. In May 1968, the spaces of writing, from graffiti and posters to theories of the event itself. The temporalities of 1968 go on from there. Microchronologies and coincidences, memory and forgetting, beginnings and endings, repetitions, the extended timelines of Africa's 1968, private space, public space, the archive. In conclusion, I'd like to turn to a final time-space field and deliberately focus on closing the gap between 1968 and us. And I guess what strikes me as new on the 50th anniversary compared to the 40th and the 30th, which were times that I was also thinking about the events of 1968, is that in 2018, we seem far enough from the past that we can approach it freshly with new eyes, being critical of its successes and its exaggerations and even delusions, but also admiring the connections and the resonances between that time and ours. And the perfection of that state in light of the events on campus today is quite obvious. Because 68 is past 50 years, we can relate to it anew and actually see in new ways the connections that bind us to that time with their ongoing vitality. So 4 concluding theses. That's the last slide. I didn't itemize them because I thought maybe I'd run out of time. The first is that we live in a different time today than 1968 that is the same. The simultaneity and multiplicity of the 1968 era has intensified. Our different time is the time of the eternal now and the infinite instant. This is the longest I've gone without checking my iPhone all day. The tensions between the local and the global that were felt in 1968 are still felt today, and they have become rigid and ossified. Now, against this pessimistic view of the eternal now, in which simultaneity and multiplicity become a type of media sphere prison house, I would like to contrast, and this is the second part of the first point, what Alain Badiou refers to as the eternal truth of events. Badiou himself is following up on these 1968 era theorists of the event. For Badiou, events surge up in a way that opens the fixed and dried and oppressive to the voices of the multitude. I think Frederic is going to talk about a type of impossibility that undermines revolution, and Ludwig talked about suspended time. There's some logic of events, and for Badiou, he makes an ontological claim about them. The problem with that is that he has to decide what's a true event and what's a false event. So that's an issue. Secondly, the advantage of the 1968 generation is that they had confident philosophies of history that provided narratives that motivated people. And this is our deficit. We lack a view that history itself has a common meaning and direction, a philosophy of history that is simple enough to motivate people but complex enough to do justice to reality. Motivating philosophies of history are on easy display on the political right. Immigrants are taking our jobs. The terrorists want to kill us. The government is taking my taxes. These are clear philosophies of history, politically salient consequences. The flip side of our deficit is that, as Daniel Cohn-Bendit said 10 years ago in English, we should forget 1968. Because if 1968 is a fetish, an impossible bar against which all other emancipatory movements are measured, we will always come up short. The horizon, the time horizon of the commune on the left in the late 19th, early 20th century was replaced by the Russian Revolution of 1917. New events make other events fade into the horizon. And so this goes back to Badiou. What does it mean to be open to new events? Open to new possibilities against the way that nostalgia can be corrosive. The last 2 points very quickly. 1968 did change life and set in motion living traditions that continue today. The genie cannot be put back in the bottle. The transformation of everyday life, relations between parents and children, teachers and students, men and women, new social movements, from Black Power to Black Lives Matter, from the women's movement to Me Too, and critical thought, critiques of representation that celebrate infinite multiplicity. We've learned how to expand the notion of politics and power beyond the state. My relation to myself, my relation to you as other subjects, our relationships to institutions, to states, humanity, and nature. All of these ways of being critically in the world are legacies, living traditions of 1968. The last point, number 4, is to call on the analogical imagination, to look for similarities and differences. And in this sense, the challenges of today are no different than the challenges of 1968. People are afraid of taking risks and standing up for what's right, because doing that often has consequences. It is difficult to organize. There is joy in being with and working with other people. The challenges are very similar, and the resonance, the analogies of the searches for difference and justice, diversity and equality between now and then. I think I'll leave it there.
Merci à tous. Je tiens évidemment à remercier les organisatrices et les organisateurs pour cette invitation.
I'm sorry for the interruption. We actually, for those who don't speak, who cannot understand French, there is a written translation of the paper in English that should be circulating here. Be circulating. Sorry.
Ok, j'ai perdu mon anglais ces dernières années en allant trop souvent au Brésil et aux Amériques du Sud. J'espère que la coopération entre avec Olympia me permettra de le récupérer. Je commencerai cette présentation par une première chose à dire concernant ma génération, c'est-à-dire la génération de ceux qui sont nés dans les années 60, milieu, fin des années 60, début des années 70, c'est-à-dire une génération d'individus trop jeunes pour avoir vécu directement 68, mais trop vieux aussi pour ne pas nous sentir complices et solidaires de ce monde culturel, symbolique, social qui est celui d'aujourd'hui et du système général de production des richesses qui s'est édifié à partir des années 80 et qui se retrouve au centre des contestations contemporaines sous l'appellation de néolibéralisme. Je crois que ma génération aura été la génération de l'entre-deux. C'est-à-dire on a reçu en héritage des émancipations dont on était obligé de remercier nos aînés de les avoir permises, on n'était même pas les acteurs, et en même temps on est complice d'un système d'approfondissement des inégalités, de destruction des services publics, de dégradation de l'écosphère, dont les jeunes générations nous rendent, et avec justice, responsables en disant « qu'avez-vous fait ?» Voilà. Donc j'emploie à dessein ce terme de génération parce qu'il me semble, ce serait peut-être la première idée, que un des héritages peut-être de 68, une des traces plutôt de 68, c'est que au fond, l'autoréflexion politique de soi se fait prioritairement à partir de l'idée de génération. C'est-à-dire la question de savoir qu'en est-il de mon identité politique passe à travers le filtre à quelle génération est-ce que j'appartiens. Cette solidarité du concept de génération et de mai 68 me semble assez fort, même s'il est évident que ce concept, évidemment, remonte à la première chose. Voilà. Après ce préambule, je reviens au thème de ces journées d'études. Je ne suis pas un historien de 68, donc je n'ai pas de légitimité à essayer de parler en historien de 68. Vous l'avez indiqué, mon domaine premier est celui de la philosophie, et donc ce que je vais essayer de faire, c'est de poser cette question à la fois simple et impossible: qu'est-ce qu'une révolution? Ou plutôt, comment penser la révolution à travers le filtre du temps, puisqu'il est question du problème du temps, de l'événement, etc. Alors pour commencer, je prendrai une première définition que vous voyez, si vous voulez, que j'extrais de manière très libre d'une lecture d'Arendt, voilà. Et je dirais, au fond, la révolution, c'est un témoignage, c'est le témoignage d'une capacité, c'est le témoignage de la capacité humaine à commencer quelque chose ensemble. Ce sera peut-être ma première définition. Alors le problème, c'est de savoir qu'est-ce qu'on appelle commencer. Quand on dit que la révolution, c'est la capacité humaine à commencer quelque chose. Ce commencement dont je parle, évidemment, n'est pas du tout un simple début, c'est pas l'indication du terme initial d'un processus, et il faut entendre par commencement quelque chose de plus large, c'est-à-dire le commencement, c'est l'ouverture d'un monde, le déploiement d'un champ des possibles, l'introduction d'une nouveauté, le surgissement d'une dimension qui n'existait pas, etc. C'est-à-dire que commencer, c'est rendre présente aujourd'hui la possibilité d'un autre monde. Donc c'est installer au cœur du présent la possibilité de l'avenir. Ce serait, si vous voulez, ce serait ça une définition initiale, avec cette difficulté, je trouve, qui est une grande difficulté philosophique, enfin pour moi, c'est ce que je vais essayer de défendre, avec l'idée qu'il ne s'agit pas d'actualiser dans son effectivité le futur, je reviendrai sur cette idée, je la donne de manière ésotérique simplement, il s'agit de rendre présente la possibilité simplement d'un autre monde. Donc, encore une fois, ce que j'essaye de dire, c'est qu'on ne parle pas de commencement comme on parle d'une séance de cinéma ou même d'une séance de colloque qui commence à telle heure et qui finit à telle heure. Ce n'est pas une entame dans l'échelle du temps. Il y a une temporalité, des colloques, des séances de cinéma, les femmes, les hommes aussi naissent à un moment, meurent à un autre. Mais ce que j'appelle ici le commencement, et le commencement politique, c'est autre chose qu'un processus, c'est ce que j'appelle aussi par commencement politique, j'entends le fait de planter l'épine du futur dans la chair du présent. Alors, je reviendrai là-dessus parce que c'est très important pour comprendre ce qu'on appelle un événement. Pour vous rendre sensible l'idée de commencement, j'aurais aussi cette formule, le contraire de commencer, c'est recommencer. Et ici, j'ai été très sensible, par exemple, dans le livre de Koustimos, à tout le passage sur la reprise du travail dans les usines mondaires. Je ne sais pas si vous vous souvenez de cette scène, de cette femme qui dit « Mais enfin, je ne veux pas rentrer dans l'usine, je ne veux pas recommencer à travailler parce que recommencer, c'est précisément la défaite du commencement. » On a cette expression en français qui est l'expression des repris de justice. On parle des repris de justice. Je ne sais pas comment on pourrait dire ça en anglais. Et d'une certaine manière, ce qu'on peut appeler le peuple, les opprimés, ce sont des repris de l'histoire. Voilà. Et qu'est-ce que c'est que l'après-révolution? C'est les lendemains gris des repris d'histoire. Voilà, on peut dire des repris de justice. Donc, ce que j'essaie d'entendre par là, c'est, je vais essayer de continuer à creuser cette idée en prenant une première définition très classique de la Révolution, que je prends chez Marx. Enfin, c'est un passage très connu de la contribution de l'économie politique à ce propos, où il écrit « À un certain stade de leur développement, les forces productives matérielles de la société entrent en contradiction avec les rapports de production présents, ou ce qui n'en est qu'une expression juridique, les rapports de propriété. De forme de développement des forces productives qu'ils étaient, ces rapports se changent en chaîne pour ces dernières, alors s'ouvre une époque de révolution sociale. » Je ne dis pas que c'est toute la pensée marxiste sur la Révolution, je dis seulement qu'on peut penser la Révolution comme cette manière dont l'histoire progresse par grandes secousses. Une espèce d'étapes douloureuses et de forçage du futur dans le présent. Et peu à peu, révolution après révolution, et bien quelque chose comme le progrès de l'humanité avance. J'ai essayé de donner une autre définition de la révolution et du commencement. Je prends une seconde citation pour mieux faire entendre cette seconde définition. Je la trouve chez Chateaubriand dans les Mémoires d'Outre-Tombe. C'est un passage très beau où il écrit, alors il parle de la révolution de 1789, il écrit « Lorsque, avant la Révolution, je lisais l'histoire des troubles publics chez divers peuples, je ne concevais pas comment on avait pu vivre en ces temps-là. Je m'étonnais que Montaigne écrivît si gaillardement dans un château dont il ne pouvait faire le tour sans courir le risque d'être enlevé par des bandes de ligueurs ou protestants. La Révolution m'a fait comprendre cette possibilité d'existence. » Alors, ce qui est très fort ici, c'est cette idée que qu'est-ce que c'est que la Révolution? C'est ce qui fait comprendre une possibilité d'existence. Et il continue, les moments de crise produisent un redoublement de vie chez les hommes. C'est-à-dire cette possibilité d'existence s'entend immédiatement comme intensité supérieure. Et il continue, dans une société qui se dissout, là peut-être il reprend justement un schéma plus marxiste avec beaucoup de guillemets, qui se dissout et se recompose, la lutte des deux génies, le choc du passé et de l'avenir, le mélange des mœurs anciennes et des mœurs nouvelles, forment une combinaison transitoire qui ne laisse pas un moment d'ennui. Les passions et les caractères en liberté se montrent avec une énergie qu'ils n'ont point dans la cité bien réglée, l'infraction des lois, l'affranchissement des devoirs, des usages et des bienséances, les périls même ajoutent à l'intérêt que se désordre, le genre humain en vacances, alors c'est cette expression que je trouve géniale, l'idée que la révolution c'est le moment où l'humanité est en vacances. L'humanité est en vacances, se promène dans la rue, débarrassé de ses pédagogues, rentrer pour un moment dans l'état de nature et ne recommençant. Là c'est le recommencement. Après la Révolution, on recommence. et ne recommençant à sentir la nécessité du frein social que lorsqu'il porte le joug des nouveaux tyrans enfantés par la licence. La citation est un peu longue, je m'en excuse, mais je trouve qu'on a au moins deux idées fortes là-dedans. D'abord l'idée que la Révolution fait entrer dans une temporalité qui est celle des intensités supérieures, ce que par exemple Gilles Deleuze appelle la vitesse, quand il parle de la cinquième partie de l'éthique de Spinoza. Et où est-ce que j'en suis? Oui, voilà. C'est-à-dire, c'est l'idée que la révolution fait surgir des énergies inédites, inconnues, et c'est le mode de présence, ce que j'appelle le mode de présence de l'avenir. C'est-à-dire les forces du futur, les énergies de l'espérance sont libérées, répandues, précipitées au cœur du présent, et cette libération suspend le temps plus qu'il ne le réalise. J'essaie de faire entendre ici, par rapport à la révolution, la définition classique de la révolution comme réalisation de l'histoire, c'est de dire au fond la révolution, au contraire, est ce qui met en suspens l'histoire parce que le présent est suspendu en ceci que s'y libère la possibilité même du futur. Mais après, c'est l'idée qui pour moi est un peu complexe, c'est que ce qui se libère à l'intérieur du présent, c'est le futur comme pure possibilité. C'est l'événement de la possibilité du futur que réalise la révolution. Et ici, les repères pour penser ça, je les ai trouvés chez Arendt quand j'essaye de travailler ce qu'elle appelle le commencement, oui, c'est la définition même de la politique, ou peut-être même chez Foucault, quand justement en reprenant ce qu'il a pu. C'est une révolution très controversée, mais ce qu'il a pu ressentir au moment de la révolution d'Iran, ou ce qu'il a pu vivre aussi de manière directe en Tunisie, quand il dit au fond, ce qu'il appelle lui le soulèvement, c'est une coupure du temps, ça coupe le temps. Ça ne réalise pas l'histoire, ça coupe le temps. Alors c'est cette idée que je voudrais défendre un peu, l'idée que la révolution c'est une contre-histoire. De la même manière dont on parle de contre-expertise, de contre-pouvoir, c'est une contre-histoire. Voilà. Donc, je suis dans une lecture ici de la Révolution où j'essaie de dire le futur qui vient planter son épine au cœur du présent, ce n'est pas le futur comme force motrice de l'histoire, comme actualisation du progrès, c'est le futur comme vertige du présent, comme ouverture de l'évidence toujours oubliée et toujours recouverte que la politique peut être autre chose que la gestion du réel. De la même manière que quand on désobéit, mais au sens, si vous voulez, pas au sens criminel délinquant, quand on désobéit à sa propre histoire, c'est qu'on prend conscience que son existence peut être autre chose que la gestion des affaires publiques. Et après, c'est rare, dans nos vies comme dans l'histoire des peuples, c'est mauvais. Et il me semble que ce mode de présence intempestif de l'avenir dans la Révolution permet de comprendre pourquoi j'emprunte cette idée. Alors là, voilà. Pourquoi j'emprunte cette idée à Kant? Pourquoi les révolutions sont toujours ratées et toujours réussies? C'est Kant, dans le conflit des facultés, lui aussi avec en souvenir 1789, mais aussi la terreur, puisqu'il écrit le conflit des facultés après l'épisode de la terreur, dit au fond les révolutions sont toujours ratées, mais en même temps elles sont toujours réussies. Elles sont toujours ratées, les révolutions, pourquoi? Parce qu'elles produisent, alors on en a parlé, ça finit toujours mal, comme on dit, c'est-à-dire ça produit des retours punitifs d'autorité, c'est la fin du texte de Chateaubriand, parce qu'on peut se demander aussi quand, pour certaines révolutions, le prix à payer est celui de la violence, des morts et du sang, on peut dire est-ce que ça valait vraiment le coup? Est-ce que c'était pas un peu disproportionné par rapport aux acquis? Et puis aussi, ce qui fait qu'elles sont ratées, c'est parce que l'histoire politique, au sens faible, au sens de l'histoire de la domination, des calculs, des garanties de sécurité, c'est-à-dire ce que Benjamin appelle la catastrophe. L'histoire, c'est la catastrophe. La catastrophe, très belle phrase de Benjamin, la catastrophe, c'est quand tout continue comme avant. Ça recommence toujours après la Révolution. Et c'est ça, l'histoire, c'est toujours la catastrophe. Donc ça, elles sont toujours ratées en ce sens. Mais, dit Kant, en même temps, elles sont toujours réussies. Et là, il donne deux éléments qui sont importants pour comprendre pourquoi elles sont toujours réussies. D'abord parce qu'elles ont fait spectacle, il emploie ce mot, et ensuite parce qu'elles ont suscité un enthousiasme. Alors, je voudrais m'arrêter un peu sur ces deux concepts, le concept de spectacle et le concept d'enthousiasme. Quand il dit concept de spectacle, je reprends ma première définition, capacité de commencer quelque chose ensemble, cet ensemble, c'est l'élément proprement politique. Pour Arendt, c'est-à-dire au fond, c'est la redécouverte d'une capacité commune à se poser la question comment voulons-nous être gouvernés. Tout le phénomène, on en a parlé ici, des comités d'action en 68, des conseils d'ouvriers que travaillait Arendt pour les révolutions hongroises, ou alors des AG même maintenant ou en 68, c'est toujours un spectacle, c'est-à-dire c'est la théâtralisation, c'est la mise en scène des conditions de possibilité du politique. C'est ça, au fond, qu'est-ce que c'est que la révolution? C'est le moment où est théâtralisée la condition de possibilité du politique lui-même. Et cette théâtralisation produit un enthousiasme, et l'enthousiasme révolutionnaire, l'expression de Kant, est une sympathie d'aspiration qui frise l'enthousiasme. Au fond, je propose ici cette lecture. De la même manière dont Kant dit au fond qu'est-ce que c'est que le remords, c'est l'écho dans la sensibilité de la liberté morale, qui est quelque chose d'indémontrable, et on sait que ça existe quand même, la liberté morale, parce qu'on a des remords, donc si vous voulez, c'est bien que le transcendantal de la liberté a des échos. De la même manière, l'enthousiasme, c'est l'écho dans la sensibilité commune et collective, et bien, ce que j'avais écrit, oui, voilà, l'écho de la volonté politique pure. Et ça, dit Kant, dans le même texte, ça ne s'oublie pas. Ça ne s'oublie pas. Alors ici, je vais peut-être simplement indiquer cette idée qu'il faudrait peut-être approfondir. En tout cas, je n'en ai qu'une formulation à la fois fragile et maladroite. C'est que ce non-oubli, quand Kant dit, au fond, ça ne s'oublie pas la révolution. Et pourtant, on vient de dire, mais après, on recommence. Voilà, on recommence. Ça ne s'oublie pas, mais la difficulté, c'est que ce qui ne s'oublie pas, c'est pas forcément ce dont on parvient à se rappeler. Vous allez me dire, est-ce que je ne suis pas dans la contradiction? En même temps, toute la psychanalyse est quand même fondée là-dessus. La psychanalyse est fondée sur l'idée que ce qu'on a refoulé, ça ne s'oublie pas, c'est-à-dire que ça n'arrête pas d'être présent dans les symptômes, et ce qui fait qu'on n'oublie pas, c'est qu'on ne peut pas s'en souvenir. C'est propre des événements refoulés. Ce que j'essaye de dire par là, avec ces constructions peut-être un peu bancales, et je reprends ici aussi une phrase d'un penseur un peu maudit italien qui avait écrit un très beau livre sur Rosa Luxembourg et le micro Spartacus, qui s'appelle Dario Giussi, je ne sais pas si vous connaissez, qui avait cette très belle phrase: ce qui importe vraiment du passé, c'est ce dont on ne se souvient pas. Ce qui compte vraiment dans le passé, c'est ce dont on se souvient pas. Ce que j'essaie de dire par là, encore une fois, c'est très fragile et je le mets en débat, voilà, c'est que il faudrait penser que le mouvement révolutionnaire, c'est ce qui va rappeler à la conscience de l'humanité que la politique peut être autre chose qu'une logique de la domination, je l'ai dit, c'est-à-dire, je le redis autrement, ce que j'appelle ici politique, c'est l'immémorial de l'histoire. Et ce qui se répète dans les révolutions, c'est l'immémorial de l'histoire. Et c'est ce qui ne peut que se répéter. Après, il faudrait construire, et là je suis spéculation peut-être trop, comment dire, à la fois imprécise. Il faudrait dire que le recommencement, c'est pas la répétition. Ce qui ne cesse de se répéter dans la Révolution, c'est l'immémorial. Et le propre du commencement, c'est comme commencement politique, c'est qu'on ne peut que répéter. Et donc, j'essaye de... Oui, alors là, qu'est-ce que j'avais... Je passe un peu, j'avais simplement ici tenté de faire un lien avec l'idée de désobéissance, justement, mais enfin, le lien, c'est celui que je vous ai indiqué tout à l'heure. Ce qu'on peut appeler désobéir, ici, c'est, je reprends ma formule, ne pas se résigner à considérer sa propre vie comme la gestion monotone des affaires courantes. Et au fond, la désobéissance, c'est aussi faire l'expérience de soi comme d'un insubstituable. C'est pour ça que pour moi, cette idée de désobéissance s'articule sur celle de responsabilité. C'est-à-dire, désobéir, c'est répondre au présent. Et le propre de la révolution, c'est qu'il s'agit dans une révolution d'une responsabilité politique à la provocation de l'intolérabilité de l'histoire. Je ne sais pas si je l'avais noté. Oui, là je vais essayer. Je vous les donne, c'est des fragments de méditation, je m'excuse, c'est très... Ça me permet quand même, voilà, j'essaie d'avancer dans cette idée, c'est-à-dire de tracer un lien entre une première définition qui serait la révolution, c'est la capacité de commencer quelque chose ensemble, c'est le témoignage de cette capacité humaine à commencer quelque chose ensemble, à cette autre définition qui est la révolution, c'est la commémoration de la vie. C'est ça, c'est-à-dire que ce qu'on... Voilà, et au fond, la commémoration du passé, ça c'est la politique, c'est l'histoire. Voilà. C'est-à-dire, et au fond, le propre de la révolution, c'est qu'elle commémore l'avenir. Alors, comment est-ce que j'articule ça à partir de... Je reprends cette idée de responsabilité commune, et au fond, là encore, c'est Arendt qui m'aide à penser et à continuer. Il y a ce texte d'Arendt sur la révolution, mais aussi sur la désobéissance civile, où elle dit, au fond, qu'est-ce que c'est qu'un mouvement révolutionnaire, qu'un mouvement de désobéissance civile? C'est une manière de répéter le contrat social initial qui n'a jamais existé. C'est-à-dire que ce fantasme du contrat social, du pacte républicain fondamental, etc., l'idée, c'est qu'au fond, le moment révolutionnaire, c'est le moment où on va répéter ce contrat social qui n'a jamais existé, parce que la fondation du politique, on ne peut pas la faire, on ne peut que la répéter. C'est Ricoeur qui a cette phrase, il écrit, on ne peut pas faire la fondation du politique, on ne peut que la répéter. Donc j'en arrive à cette peut-être ultime définition. Après je passe à autre chose pour finir. Il me restera 4 minutes, tant mieux. J'en arrive à cette idée que la révolution est précisément un événement total, en ceci que, qu'est-ce que c'est qu'une révolution? C'est un présent suspendu où se croise une origine qui n'a jamais eu lieu, un passé immémorial, et qu'il s'agit pourtant de répéter, et un futur, mais qui n'est pas le moteur de l'histoire, mais qui est l'événement de sa propre possibilité. C'est pour ça que j'en arrive à l'idée qu'on commémore le futur, la révolution. C'est-à-dire qu'on se souvient de l'avenir. Voilà. C'est ces moments de grâce, la révolution, où le souvenir de l'avenir, c'est-à-dire qu'au fond, nous sommes toujours faits pour un monde pacifique et un monde harmonieux, etc. On s'en souvient à ce moment-là, on se souvient de l'avenir. J'en arrive enfin j'en arrive pas parce qu'il y a une rupture aussi dans mon texte, mais qui m'est venue parce qu'en travaillant à à cette présentation, je suis tombé, si vous voulez, sur deux déclarations, voilà, qui sont celles de Cohn-Bendit, qui, alors Daniel Cohn-Bendit a refusé, sauf à un endroit, de parler de 68 en disant oui, j'ai fait les 10 ans, les 20 ans, les 30 ans, les 40 ans, je ne ferai pas les 50 ans. Bon, à un moment, il a quand même dit, parce qu'il y avait Desmar, ils étaient 2 ou 3, bon, je vais quand même parler de 68. Et alors on lui dit, et alors les 68, c'est quoi? Et voilà sa réponse, c'était plutôt cette envie de vivre différemment, de dire qu'on ne veut plus de la société d'après-guerre, et d'autre part, c'est entrer dans la modernité de la société française. Et je mets ça en regard des déclarations d'Emmanuel Macron sur Fox News, où le terme de modernité, modernisation revient sans cesse. C'est-à-dire Emmanuel Macron, donc pour manifester et justifier son intransigeance face aux mouvements sociaux dans les universités, dans les hôpitaux aussi, dans les transports, etc., dit, mais vous comprenez, mon problème c'est que je dois moderniser la France. Donc, ce qui me plaît, et je finirai peut-être simplement sur cette idée qui me permet de reprendre l'idée de notre génération, je reprends cette fameuse parole de Valérie, qui est devenue aussi un titre de chanson des Doors, et puis le titre d'un roman. Même l'avenir n'est plus ce qu'il était. Ce que j'essaye de faire entendre par là, c'est qu'au fond, l'aventure de notre génération, peut-être, c'est-à-dire de ceux qui sont nés dans les années 60, ça a été celle de l'épuisement progressif du sens de la modernité. Épuisement du sens de la modernité, c'est-à-dire qu'en un demi-siècle, la modernité s'est vidée de son sens adorable, désirable, c'est-à-dire ne signifie plus ce qu'il faut désirer. Elle a fini par signifier essentiellement la concurrence comme seule modalité relationnelle possible entre les individus, ce que je rappelais tout à l'heure aussi, l'asphyxie, la planète, etc. Et au fond, je crois, et je finirai là-dessus, c'est-à-dire que je repense, en parlant de cette exténuation, de cet assèchement, de ce dessèchement du sens de la modernité, et de la manière dont dans les mouvements actuels, c'est au nom de la possibilité du futur qu'on ne veut plus de la modernité. Qu'est-ce que ça signifie, si vous voulez, de refuser la modernité, mais au nom de la possibilité du futur? Je reprends seulement certains... Voilà, ce que disait Foucault en 1983, c'était dans son cours du gouvernement de Sud et des autres, quand il commente le texte de Kant sur les Lumières, il dit au fond la question essentielle aujourd'hui de la philosophie, et dit Foucault à partir du texte de Kant sur les Lumières, la question essentielle, c'est précisément qu'est-ce que la modernité? Et pour pouvoir répondre à la question qu'est-ce que la modernité, il faut pouvoir répondre à la question qu'est-ce qu'une révolution. Voilà, je vous remercie.
Thank you to Emmanuel and to Shani for inviting me. The title of my paper is The 68 Years and the Wind from the West. You're looking at a celebration, a historic victory in the longest struggle in modern French history. As members of the eclectic but efficient coalition of farmers, townspeople, naturalists, and occupiers that had come together to block the construction of an international airport in farmland, erupted in joy because the government, after 50 years, had decided to abandon the airport project. Now, to the very tangible victory of wetlands and fields preserved from a concrete fate was added a no less powerful subjective fulfillment. The state had in effect collapsed in the face of tenacious opposition. And that fact caused the all too familiar feelings of fatality and powerlessness that so strongly permeate the recent political climate to be gloriously lifted. If the ZAD, as the anti-airport occupation at Notre-Dame-des-Landes has come to be called, is an emblem that extends well beyond its territorial reality, it is less because of anything it formalizes than because of its own working existence as victorious possibility. So I've been immersed for quite some time now in thinking about the Notre Dame movement and spending a lot of time there. As Emmanuel mentioned, I translated a book written by a collective of occupiers. And this has led me to think more generally about territorial movements. And which are movements whose particularity lies in their being anchored in a particular place. Now, of course, we have these in the Americas, from the opposition to the building of a dam on the Xingu River in Brazil in the 1980s, through Chiapas, all the way to the recent Standing Rock Sioux defense of their land against an oil pipeline. So these kinds of situated movements in the Americas tend to be indigenously led and, based in an indigenous population. In Europe, this is very different. You take the ZAD or the attempt to block the construction of a high-speed train line through the Alps in northern Italy. These are movements that are held together by people of vastly different cultures and practices with no one ethnic group or social group in charge. And I've taken together in both continents these semi-secessionary movements of defense of the territory seem to me to signal a new political sensibility, but they also alter our view of the long 1960s in quite a literal way. They actually change what we can see and what we can say about those years. And this is part of the larger historical argument that I've been developing and that I'd like to talk about today. So, any allusion to 68, whether it's made by Richard Nixon or by your mother, any attempt to narrate these years, commemorate them, immediately raises the question of what is being defended now. And this is what gives and continues to give what we call the 60s their force. And just as any mention of the 60s is always a pretext for giving meaning to a particular conception of the world today and to very contemporary political aspirations, so the land-based struggles of today in turn alter what is perceptible about the recent past. They transform and reconfigure what is visible about those not too distant times, and they give new names to what we can now begin to see or see again. So the 10-year struggle in the 1970s in the Larzac region of France, sheep farmers trying to prevent their land from being expropriated by the French army to use as a training ground. This is the most immediate French precedent to the ZAD. And now, after the ZAD's victory, the Larzac has suddenly reemerged. If you were in France in the last few months, everyone was suddenly talking about the Larzac. People who were old enough were remembering, dusting off their memories of warm summer nights in 1973 on the plateau of the Larzac, where young journalists were running around trying to bone up on sheep farming. So the Larzac suddenly emerged as a possible model for a way in which the land in Notre-Dame-des-Landes that has now been farmed collectively by old farmers and occupiers might continue to remain under their collective control now that the airport project is kaput. So suddenly, the Larzac appears not just as an afterthought or a waning moment to the long 1960s, but as a site whose deepest aspirations could only be fulfilled in the present, in the form of the communist experiments going on in the ZAD. And then from the Larzac, we can begin to perceive the whole decade of highly exemplary and even Homeric battles that began in 1966 as peasants and farmers outside of Tokyo, nimbly supported by the far-left student organizations, fought the state expropriation of their farmland to be used for the building of the Narita airport. And these battles, the Larzac and Narita, can now be seen as perhaps the defining combats of the worldwide 1960s. So what I'm saying is that the existence of the ZAD today helps us now see the Larzac and the Japanese struggles as the battles of the second half of the 20th century that reconfigure the lines of conflict of our era. And now another way of saying this is that whatever else the 1960s were, they are another name for the moment when people throughout the world began to realize that the tension between the logic of development and that of the ecological bases of life had become the primary contradiction of their lives. Any effort to change social inequality would have to be conjugated with another imperative, that of conserving the living. So what these movements initiated and what the ZAD confirms is that defending the conditions for life on the planet had become the new and incontrovertible horizon of meaning of all political struggle. 68 was a movement that began in most places in the cities, but whose intelligence and future tended toward the earth. Earth with a small e and earth with a big E. So now this is perhaps a major shift in the way that we consider the 60s, but I have experienced once before how a shift in the political sensibility of the present gives rise to a new vision of the past. And this was the moment in the when the 1995 labor strikes broke out in France, and then were followed quickly by the anti-globalization protests in Seattle and Genoa. And these movements awakened new manifestations of political expression in France after the long period of dormancy of the 1980s. So you had these new forms of a vigorous kind of anti-capitalism, and this revitalized political momentum, and not any kind of commemoration, was what led me to write my history of May's afterlives. And it was really because the workers' movement had dislodged this sentiment of oblivion and triviality that had settled over the 68 years. And I wanted to show what had happened concretely to many ordinary people, and to show that it had not only receded from view, but it had actually been actively disappeared behind walls of grand abstractions, fusty cliches, and unanchored invocations. So, in other words, the reemergence of the labor movement in the 90s jarred the 60s loose from all of the images and phrases that had been put into place by the media, the institution of the commemoration, and largely by ex-gauchistes converted to the imperatives of the market. Now these ex-gauchistes, whether Bernard-Henri Lévy, André Guzman, Bernard Kouchner, Alain Finkielkraut, even 10 years ago they were still dominating the airwaves. I mean, it is amazing that they're gone now. You know, it is really, because it's difficult to remember the monopoly of that. They were so self-important and so media anointed that they had become really the lone interpreters of the movement. And now we have their equivalents in the States, by the way, but these guys were always, could be relied upon at the drop of a hat to reenact the renunciation of the errors of their youth, and they were what I called in my book the official memory functionaries. So the labor strikes of '95 not only forced the government climb down on the issue of pensions for public sector workers, they wrested the memory of '68 out of the control of these guys. So when I was rereading my book, and this is what happens is you come to a point where you have to reread your own book, and which was published in 2002, I was very surprised to see that the seeds of the new argument I sketched out for you at the beginning of my talk was already there in its pages, and that very uncharacteristically I had ventured into the realm of prophecy, and I had said that way back then that there would come a day when an autodidact farmer like Bernard Lambert would emerge as a far more powerful figure of '68 politics than Daniel Cohn-Bendit. And I also said that what occurred offstage in the city of Nantes that spring would someday be seen to be more significant and more powerful than what occurred center stage in Paris. In other words, Nantes plutôt que Nanterre, the wind from the west. And the wind from the west was the name of a farmer's journal co-edited by Lambert, published in '67 and '68. And it's not often that what emanates from the west can command our attention in a positive way. But I will try in what follows to show why I think that the kinds of solidarities that developed in Western France and in analogous land-based struggles throughout the world are at least as interesting and possibly more interesting to consider as any of the solidarities that come to mind when we talk, say, about the global South. And to return to my prophecy, I think Cohn-Bendit's day is indeed over, and that Lambert, with his call to decolonize the provinces, his day has come, and it is only now, and again, in the wake of the Zad, that we can begin to measure the significance of that summer day in 1973, when Lambert, high atop the Larzac plateau, addressing the tens and tens of thousands of people who had come from all over France to support sheep farmers in their battle with the army, when he proclaimed, "Jamais plus les paysans ne seraient des Versaillais." Now, his reference to the Paris Commune is suggestive and appropriate. For the history that I wish to trace in Western France is in part nothing more than the continuing reemergence of vernacular commune forms. And it's not accidental that the events of May and June '68 proper in Nantes, where the Central Strike Committee was made up of a coordinated alliance between three social groups, farmers, students, and workers, is remembered under the name of the Commune de Nantes. Such a three-part alliance occurred only in Nantes and nowhere else in France. And the reason for that is that the Loire-Atlantique region was the birthplace of an agrarian left that had its origins in the paysan travailleur movement of the '60s and its creation of new disruptive practices outside the confines of the existing nationally led unions. I think this may have been Lambert or one of his comrades, he said, We had lost the habit of asking our spiritual fathers in Paris how we were supposed to think about the actions we were taking. So this group was a response to the very direct influx of industrial and finance capital into French agriculture after 1965. And in this sense, the 1971 text by Lambert, Les Paysans dans la lutte de classe, which was the first to place farmers and urban workers in the same structural situation vis-à-vis capitalist modernity, and to make a general call for the establishment of a real regional power. I would argue that this text bears comparison with canonical revolutionary texts like Fanon's Les Damnés de la Terre or Beauvoir's Le Deuxième Sexe. It conjured up a genuinely new political subjectivity, a new subjectivization that emerges in the pages of Lambert's book in the form of the paysan, or defender of the earth. So, along with Debout les damnés de la terre, Debout D-E-B-O-U-T, we can put Debout B-O-U-E, Debout. So, what I would like to do today is, and I don't have, I'm sorry, I don't have a PowerPoint, but I think you can keep these four movements that I've mentioned already in mind. The first is the Zad, which continues to struggle, even though they, and quite dramatically in the past few weeks, we can talk about that later. So the Zad, on the other hand, the two long land wars of the 60s and 70s, the Larzac in France and the Narita battles in Japan. And then finally, the Commune de Nantes in May, June 68. So I want to talk about those four movements in the light of three practices that they share, above and beyond the use of occupation as a form of direct action. So the first, this is Azad. The first such practice is the act of defending, per se, which is distantly in the etymology of paysan as someone who defends the territory etymologically. And then prominently in a word that has only just entered the French dictionary 2 years ago, ZAD, zone à défendre. Japanese farmers outside of Tokyo, taking a tip from North Vietnamese peasants in their war with the United States, went so far as to bury themselves in underground tunnels and trenches to prevent the entry of a large-scale construction machinery into the zone. At a moment when the state-led modernization effort in Japan had made accelerated industry the sole national value, farmers countered with their conviction that the airport would destroy values essential to life itself. Now, I imagine some of you have followed the whole ZAD movement, but for those that haven't, in Notre-Dame-des-Landes, farmers who refused to sell their land to the state were joined by nearby townspeople and a new group after 2008, occupiers who came down to help. And with the arrival of these occupiers, the zone d'aménagement différé that was supposed to become an airport became a zone à défendre. So you have a new kind of combative meaning being added to the acronym. And the act of defending has replaced the action that we are much more frequently called upon to do these days, namely resist. And I want to think about why defending is more generative of solidarity than resisting. And I think it's because resistance means that the battle, if there ever was one, has already been lost. And we're attributing to the other side this enormous power that we can only helplessly resist. Defending on the other hand, means that we already have something. We have something that we have something on our side, we have it, we value it, we cherish it, and that it's worth fighting for. So African Americans in Oakland and Chicago in the 60s knew this well when the Black Panther Party of self-defense designated black neighborhoods and blackness itself as a value worth defending. And what makes a designation of this kind interesting to me and very powerful is that it enacts a kind of transvaluation of values. Something is being given value according to a measurement that is different from market value or the state's list of imperatives or even existing social hierarchies. In the case of the Larzac, a government spokesman characterized the zone chosen for army expansion as a desolate limestone plateau populated, in his words, by, quote, a few peasants, not many, who vaguely raise a few sheep and who are still more or less living in the Middle Ages. Moyen-Âgismo. And if you read the early documents of the land that was set aside for the airport in Notre Dame des Landes, they always call it a desert, which is very ironic because it's a wetlands. So the gesture of defense begins by proclaiming value, and sometimes and especially a kind of excessive value, where it hadn't been thought to exist before, in a manner I've discussed elsewhere that the Parisian communards called communal luxury. In 1871, Eugène Coutier and the Artists' Federation, under the Commune, overturned the hierarchy at the core of the artistic world, the hierarchy that granted enormous status to fine artists, and a status that decorative artists and theater performers, skilled artisans, did not share under the Second Empire. Now, why should the labor of artisans not have the same value as the work of fine artists? And this was the manifesto that they put together. They wrote, "We will work cooperatively toward the birth of communal luxury, future splendors, and the universal republic." And what they meant by communal luxury is something like the creation of public beauty or making it such that every person has the right to live and work in a pleasing environment. But if you go from there, you realize that this is not a kind of decorative demand. It's actually a complete transformation of our relationship to art, to labor, social relations, nature, and the lived environment. So you have a kind of full dismantling under the Commune of ancient categories of artistic practices that began by proclaiming and defending the value of artisanal work. And this is the shoemaker Napoleon Gaillard, except he didn't like his first name, so he always called himself Père Gaillard. Standing in front, and he also called himself an artiste chaussurier. Standing in front, remaking himself into the barricade strategist and architect, and standing in front of the barricade that he has built. Now, anti-communards called Gaillard vain, and they nicknamed this barricade the Chateau Gaillard, and they complained that he considered his barricades to be works of both art and luxury. And in fact, he did, as you can see, because he arranged to have himself photographed in front of one, which was in effect a way of signing it, of signing it as an artistic work. So, communal luxury as practiced during the Commune or on the ZAD is a way of constituting an everyday aesthetics of process. And from here we can begin to push the idea farther towards something like the end of luxury as founded on class difference, and that what seems initially like a decorative demand is in fact a call for nothing short of the total reinvention of what counts as wealth and what a society values. It's a call for the reinvention of wealth beyond exchange value. So, a final thought about communal luxury, it means that it's not about calling for your fair share in the existing division of the pie. It means that everyone has a right not just to his or her share, but to his or her share of the best. And this is a recent construction in design. You can see that they're getting better. You know, this is their woodworking atelier. Okay, what it is that is being defended changes over time. To return to the Larzac and to the Tokyo examples and the Zod, these are what the Maoists used to call protracted wars. Struggles that keep changing while enduring and whose strikingly long duration has everything to do with the fact that their issue is non-negotiable. It can't be negotiated. An airport is either built or it is not. Farmland either continues to be farmland or it turns into something else like a housing project. This cannot be negotiated. So, but where once you might have begun by defending an unpolluted environment or farmland or even a way of life, what is defended as the struggle deepens comes to include all the new social links, solidarities, affective ties, the new physical relations to the territory, and the other lived entanglements that the struggle produced. And as new and creative ways are found to inhabit the struggle, to live in it, it becomes apparent that the state and capitalism do not have to completely collapse in order to begin living relatively free lives. That means that you can find alternative, collective, practical ways of satisfying basic needs, material, housing, food, education, healthcare. These can all be created in a relative independence from the state in a kind of lived secession that is frequently called dual power. And this is the second of the practices that, or strategies that I wish to discuss. There's a Leninist idea about it. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about how the term has come to refer to working alongside state structures, becoming less and less reliant upon them in an attempt to ultimately render the state structures redundant. And this, of course, requires the active cultivation of new capacities and collective talents. In the US 1960s, with their school breakfasts and other community grassroots organizations, the Black Panthers, to all extents and purposes, turned their communities into dual power communes. And that what they knew was that by operating at the level of everyday life and not ideology, by substantially transforming everyday life and owning it through political struggle, becoming accountable for it, they were making revolution on a scale that people could recognize. In France, the events of May and June 1968 in Nantes offer the best illustration of dual power strategy. And this is the Sud Aviation factory, which really triggered the entire French May. They were also supposed to they built the Concorde. And the Concorde briefly was supposed to have the Zod as its landing place, so there's strange circles in here. But, so, airline workers occupied their factory, and links that had been formed earlier in the Paysan Travailleurs movement allowed farmers to feed the strikers at cost or sometimes for free. At the same time, there were networks for collective food distribution, and these initiatives were coordinated by a central strike committee made up of farmers, students, and workers that were in the mairie, and they were operating essentially as a kind of parallel administration. And even the prefect of Nantes admits this when he writes later, if everywhere in France the interruption in the functioning of large-scale public services tended to paralyze the action of the legal authorities, it seems to be the case that only in the Loire-Atlantique region did forms of parallel administrations appear, animated by the strikers. The influence of these parallel circuits was so considerable that the population wanted to prolong the experiment. Now, of course, in the poorer regions of the city, who wouldn't want to prolong it? Farmers were distributing 500 liters of milk for free to the people most affected by striking. So, the active participation of a sector of Nantes farmers in May '68, bringing food to the occupied factories and campuses, created the perspective, if not the reality, of a fight with duration. The Farmer Student Worker Coalition in Nantes, however briefly, projected Nantes '68 well beyond a riot or a general strike into well-nigh Kropotkian dimensions, filling in the outlines of what life might look like if the infrastructure of a city and its surroundings were managed autonomously by an insurrectional commune. The Nantes Coalition is also an exemplary result of the process that the group at the ZAD, whose work I translated, what they call composition, and I want to end with this. This is my third example, third aspect of these movements that I want to highlight. Composition has to do with creating and maintaining solidarity in diversity. Solidarity among people of disparate ideologies, identities, and beliefs, whose coming together and staying together adds up to no final orthodoxy, just a continuing internal eclecticism. Composition is really nothing more than the fruits of an unexpected meeting between two separate worlds, and the promise contained in the becoming commune of that meeting. It is essentially a working alliance involving mutual displacements and many disidentifications. Outside of Tokyo, a coalition came into being through the encounter between farmers, who began by simply defending their way of life, but learned in the process the true violence of which the state was capable, and radical urban students who had never before given a thought to where and how the food they ate was produced. In the Loire-Atlantique region in the late 60s, farmers desired to break out of corporatism and achieve dialogue with other social groups. In fact, this was the moment when farmers, for the very first time, I think, began to consider the problems of agriculture, the problems of the countryside in a global perspective, rather than, in political terms rather than merely sociological terms. They wanted to respond to problems that the whole country and not just farmers confronted. The problem of the use of space, of weapons production, the fate of the land, land ownership, land usage. The movement organized long marches, reacting against the national Paris-based union, the FNSRA, that had demanded that they stop their march on Paris at Orléans so that they didn't, quote, stir up any shit in the capital. And equally important, so that they wouldn't come into any contact with the urban riffraff, you know, the urban revolutionaries. The Zad, with its motley assortment of different components, old historic farmers, young, more radical farmers, petty bourgeois shopkeepers from nearby villages, elected officials, occupiers, naturalists, black bloc anarchists, is perhaps the best example of an open conflict that has managed to endure and to build for itself duration in the midst of struggle. But a vernacular commune form like Nantes 68 and even Nanterre in those months is an ephemeral instantiation of the same phenomenon. And I always go back to what Henri Lefebvre said about the origins of May 68 in France. He said that it happened because Nanterre students were forced to walk through Algerian bidonvilles to get to their classes. And so the lived proximity of these two worlds of a functionalist suburban university next to immigrant slums, and the trajectories that brought students to organize in the bidonville and Algerian workers to work sites on the campuses, these precarious and ephemeral meetings beset with all the incertitude, desire, empathy, ignorance, and deception that mark such encounters are at the heart of the political subjectivity that emerged in '68. They are the laboratory of a new political consciousness. And what the Zad calls composition could be said to be the way that autonomous forces unite and associate with each other, sometimes complementing each other, sometimes contradicting each other, but always in the end dependent upon each other. When it works, these different elements strive to work together to pursue common desires that surpass each of them. And that's really important because it means that they're not trying to resolve their differences. They are not trying to convince each other or convert the other to the superiority of my way, you know. That something that in the end would end up neutralizing their differences. In composition, everyone is forced to sortir un peu de son bocage, and it's not always a pleasant experience. So why make the effort? Because the power of the movement resides once again in a certain excess. The excess of creating something that is more than the sum of ourselves, something that only the composition between our differences makes possible. So not then the reinforcing of each of the components, but their surpassing. And this is especially important in a movement whose enemies, i.e. the state, try ceaselessly to divide and conquer by setting one group up against another. And as long as their differences are clear, the state has no real target. You know, it has to divide them up in order to try to target them. When each, by way of shared experiences, disidentifies with a rigid theoretical point of view, or a stabilizing force in his or her identity, then we become more than ourselves. When young street kids plant potatoes with old farmers, or when the farmers get out of their tractors to help make barricades against the cops, a we emerges that is stronger than the sum of the individuals that make it up. The goal is not to make the whole territory over into one's image or to make neighbors into identical reflections of oneself, for then we would be left living in nothing but a poor, toothless oasis. And the communards, Élisée Reclus and Kropotkin knew this well when they wrote of the dangers of self-enclosed intentional communities withdrawn from the world. In our plan for existence and struggle, wrote Reclus, it isn't a little chapel of like-minded companions that interest us, it's the world in its entirety. The goal, as the naturalist might say, is to conserve diversity. To conclude by returning to my earlier discussion, then, it is the diversity of the territory that comes to be what is being defended. Thanks.